Hello, I want to continue some of the conversation we were having on the last part of the Cap K series. Basically, I spent a lot of it doing more of an introduction to being able to go for the Cap K against a lot of K teams, and I think that there is a lot of the strategy that I still want to be able to talk through in terms of being able to speak about the permutation, impact comparison, and the alternative. But I do want to kind of like remind you that I really think that the strategy is one that's underutilized and something that I think that more teams should go for, and hopefully this video will convince you as such. Tuning into this video, especially this portion of the video, I think could be really helpful for a lot of critical teams, regardless of whether or not you read the Cap K in specific, because I think a lot of the tips that I'll give in the context of the permutation and the impact comparison alternative are arguments that you'll see me make about a lot of different types of criticisms that I may end up talking about later on, and I think they're incredibly useful for how you think about just how criticisms interact in doing KVK debates as a whole. I think that additionally being able to tune into the part prior to this where I was kind of talking about frameworks, the link arguments, and the kind of like top level thesis arguments should be making is like really important for getting the context of this video, so make sure you tune into that in order to get a better idea of kind of like where I'm starting and why I'm talking about the particular portion of the debate that I am, because I will be referencing some of like the framework arguments or some of the other earlier arguments that I was talking about in the last video in order to kind of continue on the line of being able to make connections between different parts of the K and showing how they interact with each other in order for you to make like much more sound arguments when you're going for this argument, and understanding like the key points of contention that you need to make in order to have this part of the debate seem really clear to the judge, and making it a good clear 2-in-R option where all the kind of parts are moving in together. So let's start with talking about the permutation. The permutation, I think, is where the framework arguments can come in really handy, because the use of their argument, of the permutation argument, feeds your framework argument by proving why you need it for a basis as the idea of competition. If you are able to make this kind of like praxis framework argument that I was explaining before make a lot more sense in terms of putting the alt directly up against the affirmative, you can make a lot of arguments about why the ability to use the permutation to kind of glide over the link arguments or to make like infinite prereq arguments can be really abusive for actually creating a standard for how we think about KVK debates, and I think that it can allow you to make one argument more offensive than the other in terms of being able to maybe concede some of the ground on the permutation stuff in order to go all in on the framework stuff, or vice versa. And I think it can allow you to also kind of start the basis of being able to get rid of a permutation that you think actually might work at the level of praxis, but you really want to be able to try to just like squiggle out of by framing them out of the debate. I think that spending some time winning arguments about why the alt coming before the av means vote negative, similar to what I was saying in the context of policy affirmatives, is good here. I think in general sometimes people like really struggle with the idea the permutation as a way to think about an order of how things happen, and a way to think about the specific relationship between whether or not the alt or the affirmative comes first, and why that changes the way in which we think about the permutation when we're trying to figure out like what the judge is actually voting for. And so I think being able to like spend some time forcing the affirmative to be able to flesh out that argument in order to win the permutation can be really helpful for you actually winning reasons why the alt has a better in route to being able to resolve the av's impacts without the independent impacts of the affirmative happening. I think that you should spend a lot of time making arguments about how the ideological models make different ideological models make organizing a lot harder to admit, and that the urgency of the impacts means like slowing down due to the barriers that the affirmative poses really isn't an option. Making arguments that kind of stress the urgency I was talking about in the first video, that come from your ability to explain not just the proximate causes of the impacts that you're trying to go for, the proximate impacts that the other team is trying to go for, but actually being able to win arguments about why capitalism magnifies the impacts that they're trying to go for, can be a really good argument about why the urgency of capitalism means that the ability to combine methods isn't strategic in terms of being able to create the most efficient strategy, which I think is a decent route to being able to resolve the permutation. I think in terms of other ways to think about the permutation, I think making arguments about why being able to think about if you're able to win explanations of the proximate cause stuff that I was explaining before, then it gives you a lot of arguments about why preferring the alternative over the permutation is net better, which I think could be a much better option for a lot of teams, considering that I think it's a lot harder to make dispatch from the Cap K perspective about why innately the alternative and the av may be mutually exclusive and why they can't happen on like separate terms. But I do think there's a lot of arguments to make about like why organizing energy and the ability to organize itself is finite, and forcing ourselves to make like forced decisions between different types of strategies can be something that kind of goes along with those framework arguments that you were making before. I think at the level of impact comparison is a really important portion of the debate, because capitalism has such easy access to large scale material impacts and the ability to resolve them with a proper alternative explanation, which a lot of Ks I think like really struggle with in terms of being able to make those larger impact claims, but also being able to really make a compelling argument about the alternative's relationship towards them. I think making arguments earlier on down about why the K explains or interprets the proximate causes to the AF is really key for controlling the impact debate and making the K impacts, the impacts of the criticism a magnifier to the impacts of the AF. And I think that you should always be ready to respond to a criticism of ethics against how the criticism's impacts become weaponized as large-scale impacts. So like arguments that the other team will make about the way in which the usage of large-scale impacts is a way to like force people into organizing in a certain way or to thinking about their subjecthood in a certain way. And I think that most of this can be resolved by really good example debating that's resolved on the alternative level. But I think if you're able to win arguments that are closer to the impact magnifier arguments that I was explaining above at the level of impact comparison, then you're able to win a lot of creative in routes to be able to get past these kind of like ethical arguments against the arguments that you want to make with the cap K. I don't think that you need to go all in on a util argument in order to win these types of arguments usually, which is a route that I see some cap teams take, but I don't think it's usually the most effective because I think it makes you maybe bite off more than you can chew, when I think you can have a debate that's much more focused on being able to win why the particular impacts that are isolated and are magnified under capital have a specific relationship to the AF that can only make it worse and harder for the AF to happen. And in that world, it gives you a lot of weight going into the alternative debate. For the alternative debate, I think this is the portion of debate that really ties the K as a whole together. The most common types of distinctions that you'll see in these debates are the types of organizing model that the AF takes up, meaning like what type of Marxist interpretation are they using to organize the party, because that changes the ways in which like the alternative actually formulates itself. So whether it's Maoism and Leninism, those different types of like thoughts prioritize different types of issues under capitalism and different types of organization models that do different things to like think about resolving the issue, and can end up like force the other team, and it can end up like making you defend things like being able to take control over the state, or having like one central organizing program that's able to control the dispersal of resources, etc., or having something that's much more about creating like more localized movements that are able to think through a similar kind of like praxis or ideological engagement. Another distinction that you'll see between different types of alternatives are ones that talk about vertical versus horizontal organizing. This is basically a way for you to think about the way in which different organizing models create both a communication of information but also a communication of responsibilities. It's the way that you'll see a lot of debates pop up in the context of like making these movements accountable to the types of structural issues that happen within these movements and the way those movements can break down. And I think that the best thing for you to do here is to become really fluent with understanding different examples of vertical and horizontal organizing movements, the pros and cons to both, and being able to talk through both sides of the debate, because I think being able to articulate both can help you in different types of scenarios, which is integral for making the strategy as general and broad based as it can be, and making it as applicable to as many apps as you want to. And deciding your stance on these issues is really important for being able to create a really specific strategy that has a response to the app that I think allows the Cap K move from this kind of like generic strategy in the beginning of the debate to something that's much more well developed and feels like it was made literally to answer whatever app you're reading against. And in general, I hope this was really helpful for you to be able to think about how you should be resolving critical affirmatives, and hopefully you'll be able to tune into the rest of the series that I'll be doing.